Have you ever imagined how the story might have been different if Shrek had accepted the throne of Far, Far Away in Shrek the Third instead of handing that responsibility over to Artie? That single change could completely alter the direction of the narrative. In this video, we're going to explore that exact possibility. An alternate universe where Shrek becomes the new king of the kingdom. The goal is to look at how this decision would change the events of the story, how the characters might react to this kind of leadership, and what the future of Far, Far Away would look like under the rule of an ogre. Right from the beginning of Shrek the Third, it's very clear that Shrek absolutely hated the idea of taking the throne. To him, the mere possibility of ruling a kingdom already sounded like a massive problem. Shrek had always valued the simple life he lived in his swamp, far away from rules, ceremonies, and formal responsibilities. The thought of trading that freedom for a routine filled with protocols and royal obligations deeply bothered him. When King Harold falls ill, the situation quickly changes. Unable to carry out his duties, the king allows Fiona and Shrek to temporarily take over some of the responsibilities of the crown. They begin attending official events, public ceremonies, and commitments that used to be part of the king and queen's routine. Since Harold could no longer fulfill those obligations, the responsibility fell directly on his daughter and son-in-law. It's exactly at this moment that it becomes obvious how out of place Shrek was in that environment. Unlike Fiona, who grew up surrounded by royal traditions, Shrek spent his entire life isolated in a swamp, with no contact whatsoever with etiquette rules or formal behavior. To him, that entire world full of protocols felt completely foreign. This difference shows up in a series of awkward situations. During a ceremony, he accidentally sinks a boat after carelessly throwing a bottle. On another occasion, while handling a sword without much caution, he ends up hurting someone by mistake. Surrounded by so many social rules he doesn't understand, Shrek also nearly puts himself in an extremely embarrassing situation by showing behavior that is completely inappropriate for a formal event. These moments make it clear, both to the audience and to Shrek himself, that he doesn't feel prepared to take on the role of king. That position required a kind of posture that simply didn't match who he was. That's exactly why he decided to search for a legitimate heir to take the throne. Someone who truly had a connection to the royal bloodline. That search eventually led him to Artie, who ended up being presented as the best solution to take over the future of the kingdom. From Shrek's point of view, being an ogre was already reason enough to believe he would never be able to meet the expectations that came with the position. He was fully aware that the court, and the kingdom itself, expected a very specific type of ruler. Someone refined, polite, and comfortable with the formalities of royalty. Traits that definitely were not part of his personality. Even so, if we analyze the situation more closely, there's a possibility that Shrek could actually have become a surprisingly effective king. If he managed to control his impulsive reactions and remain calmer during tense situations, he might have developed a style of leadership very different from what the kingdom was used to seeing. The biggest obstacle, however, would be his temper. Shrek has always been known for having an extremely short fuse. This trait of his personality could become a serious problem if he held a position of authority as powerful as the throne. With enough power to make important decisions, any impulsive reaction could lead to serious consequences. In moments of anger or frustration, Shrek might end up making rushed decisions, giving orders without thinking about the consequences. An action taken in the heat of the moment could turn an ordinary situation into something much more serious, creating problems that would be difficult to solve within the kingdom itself. In more extreme cases, this kind of impulsive decision could even trigger unexpected political conflicts or crises. To avoid that kind of situation, Shrek would need to constantly control himself. That would require an enormous effort on his part, since controlling his impulses has never been something that comes naturally to him. Over time, the need to constantly hold himself back could turn into a heavy burden in his daily life. That constant pressure would likely make Shrek a king who was clearly unhappy with the role. He would carry out his duties because he had no choice, but he would hardly show any enthusiasm for the position he held. Instead of embracing the throne with pride, he would probably see it as an unavoidable responsibility. In the castle corridors and audience halls, it would be common to see him with a closed-off expression, clearly uncomfortable with life at court. Long meetings, formal ceremonies, and public events would likely be the kinds of activities he would try to avoid whenever possible. Whenever he had the chance, Shrek might simply disappear for a while just to be alone, far from the demands of royalty. Even with all these difficulties, his authentic personality would eventually stand out. Unlike many rulers who try hard to maintain a perfect image, Shrek would never try to pretend to be something he's not. That honesty, even if a bit rough around the edges, could end up creating a very different style of leadership within the kingdom. That sincerity, even when mixed with his constant bad temper, would likely win over part of the population. Many people would see Shrek as a ruler who doesn't try to hide who he really is. Unlike kings who rely on carefully prepared speeches and calculated behavior, he would express his opinions openly, without hiding his irritation, impatience, or displeasure. For some of the people, this would be seen as genuine honesty. The idea of a king who rules without masks could create a sense of connection, especially among those who have always felt distant from the royal family. With Shrek in power, the court of Far, Far Away would undergo major changes. Traditional customs, usually marked by excessive luxury and rigid formalities, would no longer carry the same importance. Shrek wouldn't see much point in maintaining traditions purely for appearances or status, and he would naturally start adapting the way the castle operates to fit his own lifestyle. Royal meals, for instance, would completely lose the refined tone that once defined royal banquets. Instead of delicate and carefully prepared dishes, the tables would be filled with simple, heavy foods served in large portions. The meals would feel much closer to something you'd find in a swamp than in a kingdom known for its elegance. Official celebrations and parties would also change. Rather than extremely formal events with strict rules of behavior, Shrek would likely encourage gatherings that are simpler and more spontaneous. Common people would have a stronger presence, and the focus would shift away from etiquette toward a more relaxed kind of fun. Even the appearance of the castle would start to reflect these changes. Perfectly trimmed gardens and overly decorated halls might give way to spaces that are more practical and less focused on aesthetics. Elements that once symbolized royal tradition would gradually be replaced by environments shaped by Shrek's personal taste and preferences. This sudden break from tradition would make many nobles uncomfortable. Some of them would feel completely out of place inside the castle, watching long-standing customs disappear quickly. For the common people, however, the effect would be almost the opposite. Castle would stop feeling like a distant and untouchable place, starting to seem much closer to the everyday reality of those who live outside the royal court. Even so, Shrek's biggest challenge as king would likely be diplomacy. He has never shown much skill when it comes to formal conversations, diplomatic speeches, or delicate negotiations. During meetings with representatives from other kingdoms, his straightforward attitude could easily be interpreted as disrespect. Shrek would likely grow impatient during long meetings and would speak in an extremely direct way, often without thinking about the impact of his words. In many situations, he might come across as rude without even realizing it. This behavior would create frequent tension with allies and make important political agreements much harder to achieve. During moments like these, Donkey's presence would become essential. Even without any diplomatic training, he would try to make up for Shrek's lack of tact with his endless ability to talk. Many times, Donkey would end up filling the silence in conversations, attempting to ease uncomfortable situations and prevent diplomatic meetings from turning into open conflicts. Even so, the image of Far, Far Away in the eyes of other kingdoms would change significantly. A place once seen as a center of elegance and political stability might start being viewed as an unpredictable monarchy. The idea of an ogre sitting on the throne, ignoring many traditional rules of royal behavior, would create suspicion in several courts. At the same time, some leaders might interpret this differently. To certain rulers, Shrek would represent someone who refuses to bow to traditional formalities and prefers to act with authenticity. That characteristic could create a curious mixture of distrust and respect. Without Arthur occupying the throne as a symbol of renewal and hope, Shrek's rise to power might also be seen by villains as an opportunity to challenge the established authority. Many of them would believe that an ogre has no legitimate right to rule a traditional kingdom like Far, Far Away. That belief could open the door for rebellions and attempts to challenge the crown's power. However, Shrek would hardly be the kind of king who rules only from inside the castle. Unlike monarchs who delegate conflicts to armies or advisors, he would likely confront threats directly. His physical strength, courage, and willingness to face danger would make him a leader who fights alongside his forces rather than commanding them from a distance. This approach would gradually turn Shrek into a kind of warrior king. Villains would quickly realize that challenging him would not be an easy task. His mere presence on the battlefield could discourage many enemies from even trying. That type of leadership would bring a certain level of stability, since few would risk confronting someone with Shrek's reputation. On the other hand, the king kingdom might live under constant tension, since conflicts would tend to be resolved through strength rather than diplomacy. This would create a very different scenario from the one Arthur might have built, one based more on unity, hope, and dialogue. In that context, Fiona would take on an even more important role in the government, while Shrek would show resistance to royal obligations and little patience for bureaucratic matters. Fiona would naturally step in to keep the kingdom running. With her experience as a princess and her strong sense of responsibility, she would become the main administrative figure of the kingdom. Fiona would have the patience needed to handle diplomatic meetings, court protocols, and complex administrative decisions. This dynamic would create an interesting balance. Shrek would represent the strength, protection, and authenticity of the government, while Fiona would ensure organization, stability, and diplomacy. Even though this leadership model would be unusual, it could end up working surprisingly well. For the people, Fiona would be seen as a wise and responsible queen. At the same time, everyone would know that Shrek, despite his reluctance about being king, would never allow anything to threaten what has now become part of his life. In the end, the two of them would rule as a complementary pair, even if their style of leadership looked completely different from the traditional model of monarchy. Shrek and Fiona's children would also grow up in a reality very different from the one their father experienced. While Shrek spent his childhood isolated in the swamp, far from any organized social structure, his children would grow up between two worlds. On one hand, they would still have contact with the simple life of the swamp and their father's straightforward personality. On the other, they would also receive an education connected to royalty, learning etiquette, diplomacy, and the responsibilities tied to the throne. This combination would create an interesting contrast. Young ogres learning the rules of nobility while at the same time being encouraged not to become completely attached to tradition. That duality could shape a new generation of heirs very different from those who came before them. Unlike Shrek, who always rejected the idea of being part of the royal world, his children might accept that role more naturally. Even so, they would still carry part of the authenticity and spontaneity they inherited from their father. Over time, this could open the door to deep changes in Far, Far Away. A new generation of rulers might emerge, capable of balancing tradition and authenticity in a way the kingdom had never seen before. The most visible consequence of Shrek becoming king would be the complete transformation of Far, Far Away's identity. The kingdom would no longer be known mainly for the luxury and glamour typical of fairy tale worlds. Instead, it would gradually become a place that feels more accessible and closer to the people. The distance between the royal family and the common citizens would shrink significantly, since Shrek would hardly worry about maintaining appearances or preserving expensive traditions just to impress foreign visitors. His focus would likely shift toward more practical aspects of ruling. Instead of investing large resources in extravagant celebrations, massive monuments, or events meant only for the elite, he might direct those efforts toward improving the living conditions of the population. This style of leadership would make the kingdom less impressive to outsiders, but far more meaningful to the people who actually live there. Far, Far Away might lose part of the magical shine typical of fairy tale stories, but in exchange it could gain something far more concrete, a functional kingdom, closer to its people and unlike any other. Now, imagining this alternate reality, it's also interesting to think about how the events of Shrek 4 could change in this scenario. In the original film, Shrek's frustration mainly comes from family routine and the feeling that he has lost the freedom he once had in the swamp. He misses the days when he was feared, when his life was simpler and more unpredictable. But if he were also king in this alternate universe, that frustration could become much greater. Shrek wouldn't just be tired of the routine of being a father. He would also be completely overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the throne. Endless meetings, pressure from the nobility, political decisions, diplomacy with other kingdoms, and all the formalities he has always hated would now be part of his daily life. In that context, when Rumpelstiltskin appeared offering the famous contract, the temptation would be far stronger. Shrek wouldn't only want to return to being an ordinary ogre, he would also see the opportunity to free himself from a reign he never truly wanted to accept. In the original film, Shrek agrees to give up a day from his life, without realizing that Rumpel chooses the day of his birth, erasing his existence and completely changing the timeline. In this alternate universe, the consequences could be even more devastating. By signing the contract, Shrek wouldn't just erase the day he was born. He would also erase the entire story that led him to the throne. That would mean the kingdom itself would have developed along a completely completely different path, growing over the years without Shrek ever becoming king. The result of that change in the timeline would be a far, far away completely different from the one we imagined before. Without Shrek on the throne and without Fiona as queen, the kingdom would most likely fall directly into the hands of Rumpelstiltskin. Taking advantage of the power vacuum and the absence of a strong heir to defend the crown, he would find the perfect opportunity to seize full control. In that scenario, the kingdom would become almost the opposite of the one that might have existed under Shrek's leadership. People would never have experienced the simpler and more direct style of rule he could have brought. The distance between royalty and common citizens would never have been reduced, and the cultural changes Shrek might have introduced to the castle would never have happened. Instead, Far, Far Away would be dominated by a manipulative government controlled by Rumpelstiltskin in a cold and calculated way. The administration of the kingdom would revolve around personal interests and complex magical schemes, creating a structure of power marked by control and manipulation. Everything Shrek represented, authenticity, protection, closeness to the people, and a leadership style based on strength and honesty, would disappear completely. In its place, a regime would emerge marked by magical bureaucracy, confusing rules, and a system that favors only those close to power. The nobility, who already showed discomfort with Shrek's presence on the throne, would end up facing an even stricter reality. Under Rumpelstiltskin's rule, even the nobles themselves would be trapped by harsher regulations and a far more controlled political environment. Meanwhile, the common people would lose any expectation of change or improvement, living under a distant and oppressive government. Just like in the alternate timeline shown in the original film, Fiona's fate would also be drastically different. However, in this scenario, the differences would be even more significant. Without Shrek, she would never have become queen and would never have ruled alongside him. Instead, Fiona would likely have followed a solitary path after escaping the tower. Without the experience of building a family or sharing the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom, her worldview would be shaped much more by distrust and by the need to survive on her own. That would make their reunion far more distant on an emotional level. Shrek would be used to the Fiona he knew over the years. A strong queen, a companion, and a partner in the responsibilities of ruling the kingdom. When he finally encountered this new version of her, someone who never lived that life beside him, the shock would be much greater. Even so, there is an interesting question within this scenario. It's not entirely clear whether there would still be an organized ogre rebellion like the one shown in the alternate version of the original film. Considering this new timeline, it's possible that such a movement might not arise in the same way. Without Shrek as the central figure capable of uniting them, the ogres might remain scattered, living in isolation as they always had. His absence could prevent the emergence of a leader capable of turning the ogres into a coordinated resistance force. This leaves the question open and allows room for different interpretations. Another detail that would make this reality even heavier would be the absence of Shrek and Fiona's children. In the timeline altered by the contract, they would never have existed. But in this version, where Shrek had once become king before everything was erased, that loss would carry an even deeper meaning. The children wouldn't simply be memories of a family life in the swamp. They would also represent the legitimate heirs to a throne that no longer existed. Without that lineage, the kingdom would become far more vulnerable, leaving space for someone like Rumpelstiltskin to take control without facing serious resistance. For Shrek, that absence would have two different dimensions. On a personal level, he would have lost his family. On a political level, he would realize that the absence of his children also contributed to the fall of the kingdom itself. When Shrek finally realized the mistake of signing the contract and began fighting to reclaim his life, the weight of that decision would be far greater than in the original film. This time, he wouldn't just be trying to win back his family. His goal would also be to restore an entire kingdom that had collapsed without him. The story would stop being just a personal conflict and would start involving the fate of an entire population. Shrek's redemption arc would gain a much broader scale. His journey would involve not only emotions and personal relationships, but also the responsibility of correcting the political consequences that arose from his absence. Because of that, the climax of the story would take on a completely different meaning. The final confrontation would no longer represent only Shrek's personal liberation, it would also symbolize the restoration of Far, Far Away itself. In this context, Rumpelstiltskin's contract would not have ruined only the future of of a single ogre. It would have compromised the fate of an entire kingdom. When Shrek finally broke the contract and restored the timeline, he wouldn't just return to Fiona and their children. He would also reclaim the throne of Far, Far Away. Key difference is that, after experiencing a world where his absence led everything into chaos, Shrek would begin to see his role differently. Even though he would still consider the life of a king exhausting and filled with responsibilities he never wanted, he would understand that his presence on the throne was important not only for his family but also for the stability of the entire kingdom. That experience could mark the first time Shrek truly accepts the title of king with less resistance. He would still be a ruler completely outside traditional standards, but he would start to realize that the throne is also part of who he is. In summary, this alternate version of Shrek 4 would have a much larger scale. Rumpelstiltskin's contract wouldn't erase only Shrek's personal life. It would also erase every transformation he brought to Far, Far Away during his reign. Without him, the kingdom would become a dark place controlled by a manipulative ruler. Recovering his life would also mean restoring hope to an entire population. Even so, when we look at the original story of the franchise, the choice of Arthur to take the throne still makes a lot of sense. Arthur is a character connected to the royal bloodline, but his journey begins in a very different way from what you would expect from a future king. At school, he wasn't respected by his classmates and seemed to have no confidence in himself. That contrast between noble origin and personal insecurity created an interesting character arc. Throughout the story, Arthur has to learn to believe in himself and take on responsibilities he never imagined carrying. This turns his rise to the throne into a natural evolution, showing someone who eventually finds his place in the world despite all his doubts. That's why it ends up feeling like a missed opportunity that Arthur practically disappears from the franchise after Shrek the Third. Even though the third film isn't usually considered the strongest entry in the series, it introduced several important elements to the universe of the story. Alongside the appearance of classic fairy tale princesses, that was also the film where Arthur finally took the throne of Far, Far Away, a moment that seemed to have real potential to lead into new stories in the future. However, after that point, the character is simply never mentioned again. In Shrek Forever After, for example, there is no reference to him at all. That absence stands out even more because Arthur was already officially the king. It would have been natural for him to appear, or at least be mentioned, in important moments, like the celebration of Shrek's children's birthday. On top of that, when Rumpelstiltskin tries to take control of Far, Far Away, it would make perfect sense for Arthur to be involved in defending the kingdom since he was the king at that time. The fact that the story completely ignores his existence creates a noticeable gap in the narrative, as if an important piece of the universe had simply been left aside. Because of that, there's a lot of hope that Arthur might return in Shrek 5. Considering all the discussions surrounding the first ideas revealed for the new movie, including criticism about the design and concerns that the premise might feel too generic, bringing back forgotten characters could be an interesting way to strengthen the story. It would be especially interesting to see Arthur as an adult, more experienced and fully established as the ruler of Far, Far Away. That would allow the story to explore how he evolved since the events of the third film, and finally give the character the space his journey within the franchise once promised. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. And don't forget to click on the video that's appearing on the screen now to keep watching.